historic and modern, with the territories upon which our school board and schools are located. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We acknowledge that the Durham region forms a part of the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island and First Nation, and the Mississauga peoples and the treaty territory of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. It is on these ancestral lands and treaty lands that we teach, learn, and live. So Heather, do we have an agenda shared with the rest of the committee? Okay, so everybody has a copy. I just wanted to go ahead and do a motion to approve the agenda. Can we have two people to pass that motion?
We have Scott and Sandra have raised their hands.
Perfect, that's great. Thank you, Scott and Sandra. We also would like to approve the meeting minutes from last meeting. Can we get to motion to approve that as well?
Kavita and Nigel.
And I'd also like to introduce Carla Kisco. Did she make it in? Sorry, I'm having trouble seeing who's in the meeting. Did Carla make it? Let me see. Yep, perfect. She's here.
Yes.
Hi, Carla. Thank you for coming tonight. I see that you are here to join us for our meeting to speak about budget. Thank you for coming, and I'm going to just pass the reins over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm hoping that Heather, you're able to share a screen of a presentation that I've prepared. Is that possible?
Sorry, Carla, just give me a moment. I got booted out and I just have to find it again. I had it open just before you came.
Okay, not a
there
problem.
It is. Okay, now I can find it. Okay.
Perfect.
And share.
Did it share? Is the screen being shared, Heather?
Yes, I see it there. Budget, the first slide.
All right, so I can't see it on my screen, which is really strange. Hang on one sec. That's fine. I kind of prepared myself for, hang on, for it not or having the possibility of it not being shared. I really apologize for this. I don't know why I've suddenly lost my ability to see anything but myself.
Okay.
which oh, there we go.
Oh,
got it.
Okay.
I figured it out. Thank you. Well, first of all, thanks very much for the opportunity to present budget to you. For those that don't know, I'm a person that actually really enjoys school board budgeting, and I've done it for a lot of years. And it was a pleasure being asked to come and work with the board to develop the budget. So we are in a process right now that is completely odd process given past budget experiences, and I've been working in school board finance for a lot of years, and but this year's budget process, because of the situation we're in with respect to the COVID school closures, it's really presented a lot of different curveballs, and it's been a challenging process for us. The process typically, and the first slide really just shows you what an annual cycle is like for school board budgeting. And as you can see, the process starts really at the top, and the key driver behind our budget process is really our enrollment projections for the next school year. So we look at projections for September and October of the 2020 school year when we're planning the budget and working on the budget development for the September 2020-21 school year. That enrollment projection essentially is submitted to the government, and it really drives the bottom line funding. And I'll show you in further slides how important that projection becomes, because ministry funding is entirely dependent on enrollment. From that, we are able to generate an estimate of our revenues, and that allows us then to figure out what an expenditure plan could look like that would fit in the revenues provided. That's where we really do a lot of work on that fourth box there, where we look at strategically, what are our priorities for the year? What are we trying to do with the funds that we have, knowing that there's a lot of limitations and restrictions around how those funds can be used. Typically, and at the very bottom of the slide, a school board budget goes through the budget process and goes to board for approval in June. So we're actually at that point in time where we should be seeking budget approval, but we have yet to receive, at the very, very top, we have yet to receive the revenues, which has really put us quite a bit behind where we typically are at this point in the school year. Once the budgets are approved and developed and the school year typically begins, well, it begins in September, there's a period of recalculating what actually is happening in that school year. So in other words, in around October and November, boards are asked to submit revised projections to calculate revised estimates. And that really is the first quarter interim report, as you can see on the bottom left-hand side of the screen. That's in around November. And then by March, the ministry is again interested in finding out, okay, where are you tracking in your second quarter? Are you still tracking according to what your budget estimate has been? And the reason they want to know throughout the year is because, again, they give us quarterly installments of our grants, or actually it's not quarterly, it's monthly, but we receive quarterly tax revenues as well to support our budget. And for that reason, they are looking at our recalculation of their grant allocations to us at different points in the year. By November, we would have completed the school year. A school year runs from September the 1st and it finishes August 31st. And by November of the next school year, we would be working on our financial statements. So the point about this budget process is to help you understand the business cycle of a school board and realize that we're operating in 2 years at the same time. We have the ongoing existing year as well as trying to project what next year's budget plan will look like and expenditure plan will look like. Next slide. The next slide really shows you that we're a little behind in this. This was our first attempt at, and very optimistically, we were planning to get a budget done in the middle of June. Typically, as I said, that is really what the plan typically looks like. And as you can see, after the first meeting, which was a GSN similar to this budget presentation where we spoke about the revenue side, we have had to cancel our next 3 meetings with trustees and have not been able to really move forward on our budget planning. We've worked on the expenditure side, but again, the budget itself really has to fit within the revenue envelope that we're provided. And without knowing those revenues, it's become very, very difficult. So we're hoping that we'll hear soon, which will take us into a process probably dragging into July. And that's our expectation this year. Next slide. One of the first and most important things to do in the budget is to ensure that it's a balanced budget. So the ministry requires all school boards to submit to them a balanced budget. What that means is you have to ensure that your revenues are matched to your operating expenditure plan, as well as on the capital side, your capital expenditures cannot exceed the amount of money they give you for capital projects. So we work on that, obviously, to submit a balanced budget. Now, the reality is that school boards could, in fact, end up at the end of the year in a deficit, or they could end up in a surplus. And that does happen. It's very difficult to hit it right on the nose. So there might be a slight surplus, there might be a slight deficit, but again, the ministry does have requirements in place when in fact you hit a deficit. They would want to see what our deficit removal plan would be for the following year. In other words, we would have to demonstrate that we could absorb that deficit in our budget planning for the following year. So the next slide is really trying to describe for you what the difference between an operating budget is and a capital budget. And I apologize for those that are in budgeting and probably understand this really well. But with respect to operating, it's important to realize that operating budgets are really, those are the annual type of expenditures you'd experience. So salaries and benefits and transportation services, your supplies, all your consumables are considered operating. So all our service contracts, all our consultants contracts, those are operating expenditures. Capital are those things that really can be amortized. They're over a longer period of time, and they're often large purchases, and there's not an annual requirement unless, of course, you've supported it through a loan. But essentially, it's site purchases, all our major construction in our building and portable purchases that fall under the category of capital. So when we look further into our operating budget then, and this is really looking at how does it work with respect to the revenue side of the equation, which is what we're waiting for right now. Well, the grants for student needs, that's called the GSNs, and you'll hear that acronym quite a bit. That's what it represents. Grants for student needs is the main driver. You can see it's 98% of our funding comes in the form of grants for student needs, and again, primarily driven by your enrollments. That's why enrollment projecting is so key, so critical to school boards. We also receive other grants, limited in their amounts, and these are often called, the acronym is an EPO, Education Programs Other. These are really ministry-directed funds. The ministry might have specific programs they want us to support, want us to fund. They give us money for that particular purpose, and they track how we're spending it and ask us to report on that separately than our GSN funding. The other revenue side, the 1.6%, is really, those are fees and leases and permits and community use fees, those kinds of things. Again, a very small portion of our total budget, but we do have tuition fees for certain things, such as international students. So if I can go to the next slide. What we're trying to show you here is basically what's inside the box of the GSNs. The GSNs, or grants for student needs, are further broken down into categories. So the ministry looks at school foundation grant. They assume there is a principal, there are a certain number of vice principals per school, depending on the size. They also make an assumption around how many office support staff are in place and how much is available for office supplies given the size of the school. Under the pupil foundation grant, again, very formulaic funding, they identify our class sizes. So class size is a big issue. It used to be independently determined through a bargaining process, which was locally driven by the teachers' federations and the school boards. That was taken away quite a few years ago, and the province now centrally controls that. And so they fund us based on their estimation of class size, their estimation of prep time, and et cetera. They have staffing formula in our pupil foundation grant for each of these categories of staff. So educational assistants, library guidance, et cetera. And the last component is our special purposes grant. And for these areas, these are additional funds that come to us as those conditions exist in a school board. So for example, with respect to special education funding, they're looking at how many students, they have an approximation of how many students does a school board serve that perhaps needs additional special education support. Language grants, again, is dependent on the number of students that are English learners new to Canada. et cetera. And it goes down with, these again are very specific to the conditions of the board or the students of the board. And they represent a sizable component of the overall GSNs, but again, they're not as formulaic as the pupil foundation and the school foundation components. Next slide. So when we look at overall, what are the limitations when we're coming to set the budget? So ministry, again, is very prescriptive on how we do things, but they do allow for, obviously, bottom line flexibility for the most part. Essentially, first condition is you have to provide or submit a balanced budget, as I mentioned before. You can't have it out of balance. They won't accept your budget. The second thing you have to do is ensure that your class size requirements are met, because regulations do govern this. The third is every category of funding that they envelope, and special education is an example of that, where it's an envelope funding, it has to be spent on your special education program and the students within that program. It's not to be used for other things. And the last item is similar, where there are specific grants provided for specific programs. The expectation is those particular grants are enveloped for those purposes. If you look at the next slide, we tend to look now from the revenue, we're moving into the operating, look at operating, and how does it generally break down? Well, generally our operating expenditures break down with the largest component of our spending for operating being wages and benefits. And that should be no surprise. Education is very labor intensive. It's about people. It's definitely about students and all kinds of student support personnel that are in place to support our students and deliver programs. So there is no surprise with respect to that category of funding. I know for some organizations, they wonder, wow, that's a large component of wages and benefits being, compensation being such a large, representing such a large portion of the pie. But that's the business we're in. And I think we should be quite clear about that. That is the business we're in, and we're proud of it. With respect to our school operations, these are things like maintaining our facilities. This is the heat and the lighting and the utilities. Transportation costs is really a service provision where we outsource with external operators, bus operators, who provide transportation service to our students. Textbooks and learning materials, our computers, and you can see fees and contracts and other innovative type projects represent all small components of the budget. So the lion's share, again, it's a people business, and that's the reason why our highest category of spending is in people. The next slide is our enrollment, and I keep going back to the main driver of our grants, 98% coming from basically from ministry funding, and the largest component of it being driven by our enrollment. It's really a critical component. So when you look at our 71,000 students, 71,700 students, you can see that we're not growing that rapidly. It's a small growth. There are some areas of the district that are growing larger or at a quicker rate, and other areas that are contracting. But overall, as a board, it's a pretty flatlined enrollment growth. The pattern of enrollment growth, again, changes between areas, but overall, it's pretty flat. There's good and bad about that. The good thing about that is that it allows us to essentially ensure some stability in the way we budget every year, knowing that our conditions aren't changing. Sometimes addressing growth and certainly addressing declining enrollment can be extremely challenging. But you can see that the revenue does, if you look at that last box on the lower right-hand side, you can see how sensitive the revenues are, GSN revenues, to the changes in enrollment. Now, there were some questions popping up, and I don't mind trying to address those before we move on to capital, or should I just keep going? Preference there, Heather? You have your mic off.
There. I'll just have a look here at the chat. There was one around, are we making a request to the ministry for an increase in technology spending due to distance learning?
Excellent question, and the answer is I think all school boards have presented that as a stress point right now. The ministry, though, looks at the year was interrupted in March. There's still funding available. They didn't cut our funding at this point, so they see it as we having the sufficient resources for this year to address our technological requirements during this particular period of time. As we go forward, it is definitely one of those categories of spending that has always been a pressure, but even more so now. And yes, it's being presented as a system to the ministry.
Will there be additional funding available from the ministry for next year due to social distancing, and how that might look when we return to school?
We're all waiting to see that in the GSNs. Don't have
and
the
then
answer.
there was a question just about how do they value each student in the creation of the GSN?
Is that a question around how much, what's the per pupil amount provided?
Yeah. Yeah.
So overall, when you look at a budget, it can be somewhere around the $10,000 per student against all categories. But you've got to remember that that's not how, that doesn't necessarily represent, obviously, what schools will be allocated. So you're paying supplies, you're paying for your staffing, you're paying for your capital out of that, you're paying for all of your administrative supports, your professional supports, all your service contracts. So the amount per pupil is probably somewhere around $10,000 to $12,000, but it's difficult to analyze it in that context because of how you spend the dollars.
And the last one was just wondering if there was expenditures that we may have been cut last year that could be reinstated.
I don't believe there were expenditure cuts last year because, again, I think this budget has. And again, I'm making the assumption because your enrollments are pretty flatlined. There weren't significant expenditure reductions last year that I'm aware of.
And that was all the questions right now.
Okay. So if we can turn it to capital then, and I'll walk through the capital side. Again, it's important to recognize that the ministry really controls capital, even more so than the operating budget, which is very prescriptive. Capital is incredibly controlled. And there's a good reason for that. When the government basically moved to consolidating all school board budgets and expenditures and financial statements into basically their own, everything rolls up to the government. There is a real need for them to control the large chunks of money, because if we do horrible things in capital and overextend ourselves, it has an impact on the credit rating of the government of Ontario. So they grabbed a hold of this awfully quickly. So once the PSAB, which was years ago now, back in 2000, that PSAB, which was the Public Sector Accounting Board, changed the rules and required a consolidation of school board budgets and school board financial statements into the government's financial statements because they are our funding entity. Because of that move, the government really put the hammer down and decided they are going to control capital. So what are our components of capital? We've got three major revenues for capital. One is our education development charges. And again, that is a levy that's imposed on new sites, and there's essentially on residential properties and commercial properties. As the homes get sold, new housing development happens, we charge the developer in turn charges the new home buyer for that particular revenue component that they have to pay to the school board. The challenge for us with education development charges is the government stepped in and capped it. So in growth areas, and you can never get ahead of this, the intention is for us to finance out of our EDCs. These are fees charged to developers. Again, we turn around and spend that money with for developers, or we provide the money to purchase land. So this is for the acquisition of school sites. So the developer who owns the land is turning around, trying to hold us down on how much they have to pay us in education and development charges, which in fact is a simple transfer of a fee over to a homeowner. But in essence, they receive all that revenue back when they turn around and sell us the site. And it's a vicious circle we're in. I've got a lot of concerns with the way EDCs roll out, because the cost of land is always more expensive than the revenues you're generating through an EDC policy. And that's a challenge for us. We have a deficit in our EDC accounts, as do most growth boards. And so that's an issue on its own, and really truly for a more detailed conversation. We look at education development charges basically once every 5 years in terms of upping the rate. You could make incremental adjustments to that rate, but the government now capped the increases to this. So it's very challenging. Ministry grants are really, again, on the capital side, as I explained to you, very, very controlled. And I'll take you through the process. The process for approvals on capital are incredible. And that's, again, because of the fact that they don't want us to overextend ourselves in capital. And proceeds of disposition, again, this is from the sale of sites that can be put in an account and used, again, to purchase other and to make, basically purchase other sites and to do some work on existing buildings. So the categories of expenditures, I think I kind of walked you through this. We buy sites to build new schools. All of our facility upgrades to major buildings or to major building components. Roof projects, air conditioning projects. Those are major building component projects that we have going on. Retrofits, lots of child's care is coming in where we've had to convert space. Portables, when we relocate. New construction, and I'll take you through that process. And again, interest on any long-term financing. That's kind of phasing out because the government now funds us for all of our capital. So our need to go and borrow elsewhere has been eliminated through this whole process over the years. Next slide. So this is a new school process, and the reason I think it's important for you to see it is I know that when we recognize growth is happening in a community, new community development goes up, and we're always behind the 8 ball on this. It's hard to get ahead, and here's why. You have to submit a business case. It's going to put pressure on for additional pupil places. So we don't have enough space within our existing schools in the area or other areas that could absorb the growth that we're anticipating. The ministry then scrutinizes that and has to approve it. Once they approve it, they put it through their formula and say, okay, you've said you're gonna have 500 students coming out of that area. That's fair enough. We're gonna pour it through our space template and tell you how big a school you're able to build. So even though you might say, yeah, but it's 500 this year, but you could see phases 2, 3, and 4 of this development are going to take us to 700. They say, yeah, but we're not convinced yet that that's going to happen. So our space template is telling you that you can only build a school of 10 classrooms. And I'm using it just as a simple example. Very frustrating for us because you know that there's going to be portables that are going to occur. And be required as soon as the second phase or third phase of that development happens. The ministry then, after the space template exercise happens, they then decide whether or not we can go off and approve and give us approval to appoint an architect. The architect actually goes and works with consultants to develop a plan. Now, we tend to use what's called, there are plans that have already been essentially they're school construction plans that are already developed. What the architect does and what the consultants do is modify that plan for the particular area. So in other words, we're not asking an architect to start with a blank sheet of paper. We give them it's called repeat designs. We give them a design that's already been used and proven, and they do modifications on it based on the site. So if the site has hills that it didn't have in the previous design, then they have to do some modification to address the landscape and, and turn buildings appropriately. Water is another issue that has to be addressed, etc. That's the modifications an architect would do. We then would apply, again, send it back into the ministry to seek their approval before we could go off and go to tender. So the ministry then gives us approval, at which point we can go off and tender the project, and that's basically taking it out to market. And once we come back, the ministry would basically, again, look at the award, the tender award, and say, okay, that looks fine, you can go ahead. Because they have, as I said before, they've already defined the amount of money way back when they identified this in the space template submission process, what exactly we're building and at what cost. And then after we get the tender awarded, construction is built. Construction begins. So that whole process from a business case all the way to the actual construction of a school, just before you get the green light to construct, that process can take up to a year. And once you get construction happening, there you go, it could be up to another year, depending on weather, depending on timing, depending on trades availability, et cetera, et cetera. So I want folks to recognize, and I know it's awfully, sometimes very frustrating for communities to come in and say, why isn't a school built in this community? They knew construction was happening. It takes a good 2 years for an elementary school, and secondary is even more complicated, and it can take you close to 3 years to build a secondary school. If you can shorten that, it is remarkable. So I hope that helps with the process. And I think we need our communities to understand it, because it's frustrating for communities. So when it comes to other projects like roofs, et cetera, the ministry does give us an allocation. We can then determine the projects that we're going to undertake, like the roof projects or the air conditioning project. We then seek our local approval through our local approval process. That's through our trustees. And we award the tenders and construction happens. Our process is much, much shorter because there is a ministry allocation that's given to us based on not only the number of students we have, but also based on the kinds of buildings we have and the age of our buildings, et cetera, that generate funding. And we're able to then, through our trustees process, get things awarded and construction going quicker. The restrictions here, again, is in terms of funding restrictions, as I said, very project specific, limited use. The government totally controls this, and we are forced into their space template with their costings. So we argue that the funding benchmarks being used and applied to us we always, feel that it's under what is actually happening in the marketplace, and it changes depending on the market. So if there's a great demand for construction, architects, engineers, and trades, our costs were going to be higher than what the ministry's formula necessarily represents. With respect to EDCs, I spoke to you about that. We're always behind. We buy a site at a much higher rate than what is anticipated when the education development charge was originally set. And now that we're capped in this, it just causes a further complication, and the difference is even greater. So we, for 2019-20, experienced an initial and it really was only a month, but the halt in our construction that happened on April 4th, and it was lifted about a month later. And basically, we were at one point really monitoring whether or not the projects we had in the docket were going to be able to be done. We're pretty confident they will be done. There's only one project which we are in the process of approvals for that we know we're not going to meet the 2021-22 timeline. It's a 22 timeline, and that's if we get all our approvals, and that is the Beaverton Thora rebuilt school. So with respect to future projects, again, we've been monitoring. We always monitor whether or not we can complete it and have the no impact on the return of students coming back in. Funds for capital just carry forward with the project. It's not like operating. And I think that's the end of my presentation. So I'll take any questions on capital.
Okay. How does DDSB decide where capital money is spent?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the first.
So how does the district decide where to spend capital money? And you may have answered that already, but.
Yeah. So again, depending on the type of capital, but if it's for renovation projects, it is prioritized through, again, looking at the age of facility. You know, essentially, facility services has a really good handle, and they have maintained our buildings in Durham extremely well. They are constantly looking at cyclical replacement and roof replacements, for example, major project. They know exactly when the next scheduled chunk of work has to happen and at what schools. With respect to new capital money, it is all through the ministry's approval process.
A question about have school boards or our school board ever thought about solar panels for renewable energy?
I'm sure they have, because most boards have. And when there was an incentive program that the government was involved in, there was certainly a lot of attention paid to putting panels on roofs. But the government's incentive program expired. It's not as monetarily effective for the capital providers of panels. And for that reason, I think a lot of boards have now backed off. But again, I don't have specifics around Durham's involvement in it, but the other boards I have been involved with in my past work, it was a huge project. But as soon as the funding incentives dried up at the ministry, when the program essentially was no longer available for third-party operators, the program basically stopped.
Question is about if the Ontario government is loaning funds, are those funds from the federal government then?
No, it's all from central. The government basically, it's from their central funds in terms of how they fund their service. You know, education is a provincial initiative, or not an initiative, but it's a provincially mandated program. And so it's not federal funding that supports education. It's provincial.
And the last one I have here is, how is a budget shortfall handled and who makes up the difference?
So shortfalls have to be handled by setting your budget in the future year. For example, if we were, let's say, in deficit by a 1% of our budget, we would then have to build the future year's budget to accommodate that 1% by cutting programs and services in order to self-finance the deficit. Because you can't submit a deficit budget. I keep going back. So that's how you're caught in that cycle. The future year's budget can't be a deficit budget. You have to address your previous year's deficit and get it back in balance. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Carla. We really appreciate you coming to our meeting tonight.
Thank you very much. Pleasure being here. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Next on the agenda, Val and myself will be discussing the Parent Involvement Committee annual report. Heather, do you mind bringing that up for us?
All right. So the annual report for 2019-2020 year-end report. The PIC provides the school board with information and advice to help engage parents. The PIC also undertakes activities to help parents support their children's learning at home and at school. We've had 5 meetings during the year 2019 to 2020 school year. The PIC is comprised of 19 members in total. The PIC has supported the Ignite Learning strategic priorities. We'll now go to well-being. Well-being, we value how you feel. We really do. The regional SCC focused on raising healthy children, which was held on February the 20th, 2020. February 25th, rather, sorry. Our main focus was on mental health and well-being. This event had over 100 participants, including our live stream attendees. There were 2 recorded sessions which can be accessed as you see the websites. Equity. We value who you are. The PIC created a working group to focus on parents reaching out grants or programs. The ministry provided us with some $40,000 plus to support parents' engagement initiatives. Our key focus was to reduce barriers for parents' engagement and to meet the individual needs of the school committees or communities. SCC members were allowed to co-plan within their school families at the October Regional SCC, which had over 100 participants. The program working groups reviewed 42 submissions, and with much careful thought and consideration, we approved 31 of those applications. Pickering High was one of those schools that had an event on March the 7th, 2020, with over 200 participants. And now I hand over to Tiffany.
Engagement. We value your involvement. So this year, the PIC, the Parent Involvement Committee, we were able to host our Volunteer of Distinction event, which recognized over 130 volunteers. It was a great turnout. Everybody, you can see the picture there. There's a mass amount of people, and all of them were there to receive recognition for their support at our local DDSB, SECs, school community councils within the schools. Innovation. So our upcoming Parents as Partners Symposium, Be Well, Be Positive, is grounded on innovation, as this year we have adapted our current lifestyle changes to our current lifestyle changes. It will be hosted online. I hope you're all able to attend this Thursday, June 28th at 7 p.m. Early this year, we released 6 speaker series over 3 weeks that included topics such as developing resiliency, Indigenous education, every child ready to read, cultural relevancy, healthy habits, and digital etiquette. Success. We value your achievements. The Parent Involvement Committee established working groups that addressed a number of needs, including the support of programs, regional SCCs, Volunteer of Distinction, Parents as Partners Symposium, and our Welcome to DDSB Resources and Communications. Leadership. The Ignite Learning Implementation Guide and Resources for School Community Councils was provided to every school in October 2019 at the Regional SCC event. The resource included information on Ignite Learning Strategic Plan, the Parent Involvement Committee, School Community Councils, how do we Ignite Learning Planner for SCCs, as well as a PowerPoint to share with our SCCs. SCC stated that this tool assisted in discussions reflecting on how SCC support school improvement through the lens of the 6 DDSB priorities. SCC members also provided feedback through a thought exchange during the event. And yes, it looks absolutely beautiful. I was happy to see all the photographs that were included. And it's always nice to look at our year in a glance. Thanks for whoever put work into creating that and letting us be a part of it as well.
Yeah. And also this committee also will, we will be sharing this with the trustees on June the 1st at the standing committee meeting. All right, for the working groups update. The volunteer of distinction, the planning meeting will be set for in September. Welcome to DDSB resources. It has been postponed until fall of 2020. And our regional SCC meeting is scheduled for June 2020. Now we'll have our communications by Robin. Is Robin present? So Robin is going to share our e-newsletter.
If Robin's not here, I think Ted could speak to it as well, just to what we've done.
Okay. All right, Ted.
Okay, so I wasn't prepared, but anyway, we did meet and we did put together a newsletter, and great thanks to everybody at DDSB, the areas that put it together to make it look so wonderful. But it contains a lot of things that, as parents, we were thinking about what might be helpful for everybody. So, how to help with distance learning, how to help with just the situation that we're all in, what resources the DDSB had available for everybody. And I believe that the letter went out today. So at our SAC meeting last night, we talked about it, and I was able to share a preview with them, and they were absolutely ecstatic about it. They thought it was very well done and appreciated all the resources that we were sharing. And it was more or less not to have to go look for the resources, because I know they're all available on the DDSB website, but here it was, we just put it in front of all our parents so they could see it. So, and some little tidbits from parents that are actually experiencing this as well, who are PIC members as well. So I think it was very well done, and I've been hearing nothing but good news about it.
Great. Thank you very much, Ted. And yes, I did see it, and it's amazing. Also, okay, so now we're going to hear from Heather about programs. You have any updates on the budget, Heather? Thank you.
Yeah, so we received 40,000, just over 40,000 from the ministry. And so far we've allocated 5,000 to 2 programs that were actually able to be completed. One was the Pickering Family of Schools event, and another one at Lakeside. We can also put 7,000 toward the Parents as Partners keynote event this week. So we certainly have a fair bit of funds left to consider. So I'll turn it back to you, Val.
Okay, great. Thank you, Heather, for that update. All right, now I'll be reading the letter that we had received. We actually had written a letter to the ministry in regards to that program to see what we could do with that money and how we could, how really we can spend the money. So they have responded to us, and it says, "Dear Tiffany and Valerie, thank you for your letter regarding the Parents Reaching Out or program. I appreciate the planning your Parent Involvement Committee is undertaking and the desire to engage with as many parents as possible through the program. At this time, a final decision related to unspent 2019-2020 funds have not yet been finalized. If you are able to use any of the 2019-2020 funds within this school year, especially as it may relate to supportive communications to parents during COVID-19, I would encourage you to do so. Our team will share specific information to pick chairs and co-chairs on any final decisions once it becomes available. And that's from Susan Gordon. And she says, thank you. So now the question is thrown out to our pick committee. If you have any suggestions rather, as to how we could spend some of these funds, or how we could diverse the fund in order to use it to help with our within our communities. Any ideas?
If anyone wants to raise their hand, and then we can know that you wish to speak.
Nobody?
Tiffany, Christopher?
Christopher, yeah. Go ahead, Christopher. Thank you. Where's Christopher? Christopher, go ahead.
Okay, Ted?
Okay, Ted.
Sorry, just a question, how we would handle all the programs we already approved, and how we would communicate that to the to all our schools that we had already given that money to. I don't know if there's a way for us to, I'm sorry, Ms. Kisco's left, whether it's something we can envelope for next year, or if there's funding available from the DDSB to allow for that. But it'd be a shame for us to try, and I know it'd be hard to try and spend the money, but how can we save the money for those great programs that we looked at? That's my thought.
I think, and Tiffany can join in a minute as well, but it's really up to the ministry. Our letter was requesting to let them roll it over into next year so that we could honor the schools and the ideas they had. But the response is very unclear as to whether that will be allowed. And I think it was Nigel who had wanted to speak.
Yes, he doesn't have access to a mic. So what he said is, can we use it to support parents during remote learning? So part of that, I think we've already kind of touched base on behind the scenes, Valerie, Heather, and myself, just that we would like to potentially add to helping individuals to pay for some of the internet costs. We've already kind of dispensed that money preemptively, but just looking at maybe using some of that funding to aid with that, or maybe relinquishing some of those funds and, moving the budget around a bit to help support that. We've also talked about the potential for using some of the funds for two softwares that would be needed. One to engage parents when it looks as though we are working towards back to school, if I'm correct, Heather, you said?
Access to school to get all their belongings.
Oh, access to school to get all belongings.
Yeah.
And another one that we used during the initial COVID softwares, just to get everybody involved and connected. Yeah. Now, I did also have a meeting update. I was invited to a meeting with a bunch of chairs and co-chairs of all the school boards across Ontario, and we had a Zoom meeting to discuss how things were going for everyone. It seemed very casual at first, but then we did, it ended up that we wrote a similar letter to the one that Valerie just read the response to, the one that we sent out. Did everybody get to see our letter that was sent out, Heather?
I think it was sent to everyone, yes. Okay,
perfect. Yeah, I was pretty sure that it was. I just couldn't remember. So it was basically requesting that we have an extension of the funds in addition to next year's funding so that we can support all the changes and I'm actually hoping that they'll open the parameters of the funding to address more than just communications with parents, maybe mental health and well-being. So we've sent that out. I think they just finalized it today. It is very similar to what we sent out, so I'm not going to read it. It's very lengthy. It's quite a long letter, but it does include all of the names and faces from all of the school boards across Ontario. So I think that looks it's going to look really good, and hopefully we'll get some answers.
And I'll just add, I think, Tiffany, a couple of things. We can, if you share that letter with me and Michelle, we can also share that with the committee so that they can see it. And the budget, as Carla was saying, the budget ends in August 31st. So we do have some time to wait while we hear what the ministry says. And, in the background, we can look at some options that we could maybe use the funds for, but the co-chairs, we would reach out to the committee to approve that before we make any decision. I think at this time, we're hoping that the ministry will allow us to keep the funds for next year. So.
Great. Thank you, Eva. Awesome. So now we are going to have some update on distance learning. So now we're going to... Thank you, Eva.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Val. As we now know that we're moving forward with distance learning until the end of the school year, we are working with our schools to continue to provide a variety of learning experiences, both synchronous and asynchronous. We know that students have different needs, interests, and circumstances. Our Curriculum and Innovation IT department is continuing to provide ongoing professional learning through self-directed PD and online networking opportunities to share promising practices. Educators are being creative to respond to their students. We have completed a student thought exchange for both secondary as well as elementary. We've taken those suggestions and leveraged them into creating reflective questions to help our educators consider how they're meeting the new needs of their students. So the elementary one is just getting finished this week. The responses were really similar in a few areas, that the students really found that having a weekly update, sort of a schedule that would help them sort of plan their week. And then they liked having some variety and some options, so that there was a few that wanted the synchronous, but there was also a number who really wanted the video and the asynchronous learning, so that it could fit into their lifestyle, because sometimes it's hard to be on the computer at a specific time. So I think one of the greatest learnings was how we need to be flexible and responsive to our families, and that it's really working with the educators in the schools and the school leaders supporting them to work to provide the best opportunities for all of the students. We are awaiting more information from the ministry on report cards and summer learning programs. So we will share that with everyone once we have more information. School teams, in collaboration with their communities, are creatively planning how to support our new to JK parent students, as well as how they can celebrate our graduates. It is certainly a very different ending to the school year than we had planned in September 2019. Facility Service and the Health and Safety Department are working with the Durham Health on a plan to allow students access to schools in June to gather up their belongings and to return textbooks, library books, and musical instruments. We will only be collecting the Chromebooks from students who are graduating or leaving the school board, as we are unsure what the school year will start like in September. The Board of Trustees recently approved the updated dress code policy. This policy and procedure has been shared with school leaders. School leaders will gather input virtually from their SEC and students to revise their school dress code. We also have a return to school working group that is working on protocols and plans for when students can return to class. And we are considering many different possibilities at this time as we wait to have more direction from the Ministry of Education and Public Health. And finally, just to put a note in for the Parents as Partners keynote on Thursday night, we had, as of yesterday, we had 60 people registered for the event. And as of this afternoon, we had 150. So very exciting. And we know that a number of people haven't registered, but will be joining us as well. And it should be a really great keynote speaker for that event on Thursday. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Sandra, go
so
ahead.
there's a couple of questions about joining. Val, are you back?
Ted had his hand up.
Okay. Thank you. There was a couple of questions about joining the Parents as Partners live stream on. Okay. Oh, go ahead, Ted.
Okay. Thank you, Heather. I know things went out to survey the students. Something that was raised at our meeting the other night was, are we going to talk to the parents during this time? Because I know there's been a lot of discussion how well things worked, how well things didn't work. Because, you know, of course, I have some opinions on how things might have move forward better in the future. But it's just, you know, when you talk about through districts, and you know, I've talked to people in Toronto, talked to people in York and York Catholic, and we're really not compatible to what everybody's doing. So I was just wondering, you know, if it's something we can ask our parents to say, how did you feel the event went? And maybe I'm more talking from the high school perspective, because it was really an interesting experience this time. And what was being taught, how it was being taught, that type of thing. So I think it would be beneficial if we could reach out to our parents to say, did it work well? Did it not work well? You know, versus semester schools versus year-long schools. I can't imagine having to deal with 8 subjects in the thing. But, you know, how did that work? And maybe, you know, just some opinion technology-wise, how we can make this better, because, you know, my gut feeling says this is going to change tremendously in the fall. We'll probably be doing maybe some of the things the same, but how could we help? How could we do things? And maybe engaging with our parents would be a good idea.
Thank you, Ted. And with the elementary one, it did go out to parents. So there was some parent voice involved in that response, because to really get a sense of the younger students' experience, we needed the parent experience. But I know there had been some discussion around doing a follow-up to the initial parent thought exchange to get some additional feedback, because we did it very early. We did it, I think, before we really even got started. So I will take that back to the committee who's working on distance learning and share that with them.
Sorry, and just one other thing, Heather, is the discussion we had the other day was about, you know, going forward in June. I know it was a good idea that, you know, whatever marks were done as of March break was going to be the thing. So it's been, at least from my experience, a little challenging keeping the student excited about moving forward, because they could do nothing and get a good mark. So it's just giving the parents ideas about how do we keep our kids motivated in this. You know, can we get them better grades, and how do we keep them, you know, why do I have to do this assignment? And especially as we get into the later parts of June, where my grade 10 student said, well, I would be on exams the 3rd week of June. Why do I have to keep going to anyway? But I mean, you know what I'm saying. So the schools in Pickering have great ideas, but I'm just thinking to other parents, how do we keep our kids motivated, especially when this weather is so lovely, and it's, how do we get them studied? Anyways, I don't mean to babble on, but that's kind of what hit my head.
Thank you for sharing.
That was great.
I'm just trying, do the students have to return the Chromebook if they are going to a different school in Durham? I don't think we're collecting if they're going to be remaining in Durham. I think we're just looking at students that we know are leaving the district, but that'll all be verified a little clearer as we go through that process. Yeah. So someone's suggesting maybe look at a Google form versus the Thought Exchange, just to maybe access some different ideas. If you want to join the Parents as Partners stream on Thursday, it is on the school board calendar. So if you go to the school board website and go to the calendar for Thursday night, they've included the link there. And it will be through YouTube, similar to how we've set up this evening's event, this evening's meeting. And I'm just checking, have I missed any other questions, or did we have any others? I'm not sure about back to school registration. Right now, they've been working on getting the JK registration sorted and online. Because we went online last year, there probably will be an opportunity to verify return to school and return to which school. And I like that idea that Ted brought up, Margaret. I agree. I think it would, Margaret mentions, I think we might need another thought exchange to discuss what parents are doing to keep their children engaged. And I know from the educator side, some of our conversations have been how can educators sort of reflect on what's working, what is keeping students engaged. As Ted said, even though marks might not be impacted the same as normal, and also use that information to help us guide what we do the next week or the next day, and potentially support, getting better at all that we do for the fall. Because there's been tremendous learning in terms of technology that we can leverage in a face-to-face situation as well. Any direction for school SCC to close the year? Very similar. The SCCs will be expected to complete their year-end report. We have provided information to SCCs that they can roll over any of their funds. Because that's internal to the board, we can approve that so that they don't have to spend their funds for the current year, but can use that to support moving into next year. And unless there's any other questions, if someone wants to voice one or type, I'm happy to try to respond.
Sorry, Heather, it's me again.
No problem.
Sorry. We did have a discussion about volunteer distinction, and it might be something to come out to all the SECs just as a reminder that they still should be polling their community for VODs, because I believe we need to have it in by the 17th, is it? Or
it's
15th?
In June. I know.
Yeah, okay.
The emails just went out to the SCC chairs and principals last week.
Okay.
So they will work with their community. We still want to move forward and acknowledge the volunteers. We know that the ceremony, depending on where things in the fall, may look different, but we're going to plan for a hopeful and meet with that committee in the fall to look at that's why we postponed that committee till we have a better idea of what it could look like. And I see lots of great ideas. Yes, we could do something virtually. We could recognize them virtually. And potentially, if we're allowed smaller gatherings, it could be even a family of schools or a school-based event. So we'll meet in the fall and see where the landscape is at that time. There was a question about technology going into next school year for students without tech. So I guess from our perspective as a district, we've tried to respond to ensure that all families have technology available to them, whether it's a Chromebook. I think in most instances, we've provided Chromebooks. If there is many students in the family or additional concerns, that family can certainly reach out to their school principal, and we continue to try to support those individual needs. But we focus more on per family versus individual students at this time. And we'll look to the ministry depending on what the fall looks like, I think. Okay. And I don't see any other questions right now, Val, but
Great. Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you for all your questions. Okay, so going forward, do we have any other business that we need to attend to? Throwing that out to the committee. Do we have any other business? Okay, Ted, we see your hand.
Sorry, once again. It's not so much of the business as I do want to sincerely thank all the administrators at the DDSB and all the staff for everything they've done, because I know this has been unprecedented at times and everything going on. And I just want to let you know, as a parent, we truly appreciate everything being done through administration, through teachers, through the staff on Taunton Road, to everywhere, the technology. It's just been a pleasure knowing that we've not gone through this alone. But as I hope I speak for a lot of parents, thinking just a plain thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome, indeed. And Patricia said, oh, is equipment being returned at the end of the school year? Families keeping them over summer? Maybe Heather could answer that. I don't know.
My understanding at this time, Val, is that we're only going to collect equipment from students who are graduating or leaving our school board.
All right, that's the answer, Patricia. And Margaret said the list of online courses was not extensive. Are there plans to include more subjects? For example, grade 10 English?
Okay, that's through the summer courses. I assume that Margaret's asking about. We're waiting a little bit. So we've offered e-learning because that's the only option that we have at this point. And so working with, they've expanded the number of courses significantly that they've previously offered. And I think we're waiting once again. The ministry has indicated that they're going to be providing additional funding to support some of these summer courses. So we're kind of balancing to ensure that we have the staff to provide the courses and those pieces, and waiting for a little bit more ministry direction on what that would look like, or what the expectations are in terms of what we provide. So
Great.
I don't know if that's a direct answer, Margaret, but we're as in many things right now, we're kind of in a waiting game.
Great, thank you, Heather. And thank you, everyone. I think that leads us, bring us to the end, unless anybody has any other, Christopher, so most likely remote learning, most likely. Unless anyone has any more questions or suggestions, then we will bring our meeting to an adjournment. So I want to say thank you to everyone for participating tonight. We appreciate your time and your effort and your input in coming tonight and supporting this PIC committee. And thank you for giving us our chance to extend our voices and help support this endeavor. All right. Thank you. Our meeting has now come to an adjournment.